Welcome to Blazing Green, the socionomics of the next wave of pot legalization. Here's your host and the director of the Socionomics Institute, Matt Lampert.
How's that for a song on an album that went to number 2 on the Billboard chart? Halsey with New Americana. High on legal marijuana? Hey, if you're in Washington, Oregon, or Colorado, you might be. Speaking of, do you know who's coming through Colorado? The Republican presidential candidates. Do you suppose any of them will have something to say about legal marijuana? We'll have to tune into the debate and find out. In this election cycle, the debate over pot legalization has been interesting to watch. On one extreme, there's Chris Christie, who says if you're getting high on legal pot today, enjoy it because as president, he'll enforce federal law and crack down on marijuana use. And on the other extreme, you've got Bernie Sanders.
Senator Sanders, right here in Nevada, there will be a measure to legalize recreational marijuana on the 2016 ballot. You said you smoked marijuana twice, didn't quite work for you. If you were a Nevada resident, how would you vote?
I suspect I would vote yes.
And even Jeb Bush says,
40 years ago, I smoked marijuana.
Rand Paul has sought funding from the legal marijuana industry in Colorado. And most of the other candidates on the left and the right, to the extent that they've taken a position on the subject, they seem to have taken the position that it's up to the states to decide whether to legalize. The debate over marijuana used to have a lot of ethical overtones, but now it's become a states' rights issue. And to the extent that there is a moral side to the argument in the contemporary debate, increasingly we hear a moral stance that favors legalization.
We have a criminal justice system that lets CEOs on Wall Street walk away, and yet we are imprisoning or giving jail sentences to young people who are smoking marijuana. I think we have to think through this war on drugs, which has done an enormous amount of damage.
What a sea change, and not just candidate opinion, but public opinion as well. So today we're going to get into why. We're going to talk mood, markets, and Mary Jane. We'll also get into what's next for the prospects of legal pot in the United States, what opportunities are out there, what risks. Pot's one of the fastest growing industries in America. We'll talk about it. Just 6 years ago, who would have imagined that recreational marijuana legalization would be a viable issue in a U.S. presidential campaign, and that a handful of states would have gone ahead and legalized personal use of the drug? Well, one person who would not be surprised by those developments would be my colleague Ewan Wilson at the Socionomics Institute. At the Institute, we use indicators of social mood to forecast social behavior. The basic idea is that the way people feel influences what they do, so if you know how they're feeling, then you have a leg up on anticipating their actions. Back in 2009, Ewan wondered if there might be a connection between changes in social mood and changes in marijuana use. Well, he didn't really find much there, but he found something even more interesting. And that is, what did change with social mood was society's stance toward marijuana. He found that when mood was trending positively, social morals tended to be more black and white, and society was more restrictive of marijuana. And when mood was trending negatively, when people were feeling pessimistic and not as confident, they figured, hey, we've got bigger fish to fry, so what if someone smokes a joint? And they tended to be less restrictive and lift those prohibitions on marijuana. Now, one of our most sensitive indicators of social mood is the stock market. It's great because if people are feeling optimistic and confident, they can very quickly bid up the prices of stocks, and if they're feeling pessimistic and fearful, they can do the opposite. And back in 2009, when Ewan was writing, he had just lived through quite a fall in the markets, this profoundly negative period of social mood. And he wondered if that might present an opportunity for the decriminalization of marijuana. He published a report in the Socionomist called The Coming Collapse of a Modern Prohibition, where he forecasted that after a negative trend extreme in social mood, the drug war would initially ramp up, but ultimately society would capitulate and move toward legalizing the use of the drug. And it's been a lot of fun over the past few years to watch events unfold as that forecast comes to fruition. Prior to 2009, about a third of Americans supported recreational pot legalization. Since then, there's been a sharp increase in support. Now, a majority of Americans favors legalization. So the change in public opinion was swift. It came quickly on the heels of the 2009 negative trend extreme in social mood. Yet change on the policy side was slower to materialize. To understand why, it's helpful to look at some history. California's path to legalizing medical marijuana is instructive. Dennis Perrone, one of the leading activists behind Proposition 215, which legalized medical marijuana in the state, began his campaign in 1991 by getting a non-binding referendum in favor of medical marijuana on the local ballot in San Francisco. That measure passed with 79% of the vote. Now remember, in the early 1990s, there was a pullback in the stock market, a recession, consumer confidence was down, the U.S. was involved in the Gulf War, the incumbent president would get kicked out of office the following year. This was not exactly a happy, positive, optimistic time. And the legal medical pot movement gained traction in this period of negative social mood. Now, after the ballot victory in San Francisco, it took Perrone and his colleagues 5 years to get the issue on the statewide ballot in California. If you've ever tried to get an item on a state ballot, you know it can be a long and laborious process. It takes time to mobilize support and jump through all the required hoops. And by the time they got the issue on the California ballot in 1996, the negative mood behind the market corrections of 1990 to 91 had largely worn off, but the measure still had enough steam to pass with 55% of the vote. And we're seeing a similar time lag today with recreational marijuana. The stock market bottomed in 2009, but it took until 2012 for voters to approve recreational use in Washington and Colorado, and until 2014 for voters to pass measures in Oregon, Alaska, and Washington, D.C. And on November 3rd, Ohio voters will decide whether to grant a monopoly for the commercial production and sale of marijuana for recreational and medical purposes. Now let's go over some of the key points of the Ohio proposal. If passed, it would give exclusive rights for commercial marijuana growth, cultivation, and extraction to folks who own 10 predetermined parcels of land. It would permit retail sale at up to 1,100 licensed locations and create a special tax rate limited to 15% on the gross revenue of each marijuana growth, cultivation, extraction, and product manufacturing facility, and a special tax rate limited to 5% on gross revenue of each retail marijuana store. Additionally, it would create a new state agency to regulate the industry. Now note that the entire proposal is couched in terms of granting a monopoly to 10 landowners on the commercial production and sale of pot. So it's couched in terms of monopoly. Well, as it turns out, there's another item on the November ballot in Ohio that forbids the state from granting monopolies to folks who seek them through the ballot system for personal exclusive financial benefit. And in case there was any doubt about whether this anti-monopoly item was put on the ballot with the proposed marijuana amendment in mind, the measure specifies that its passage would prohibit from taking effect any proposed constitutional amendment appearing on the November 3, 2015 general election ballot that creates a monopoly, oligopoly, or cartel for the sale, distribution, or other use of any federal Schedule I controlled substance. And you guessed it, marijuana is a federal Schedule I controlled substance. So you might think that Ohio voters have a choice. They can vote for a pot monopoly, they could vote anti-monopoly, they could reject both proposals, but surely they wouldn't vote to pass both measures. Well, in fact, the latest polling data from Kent State and local television station WKYC shows majorities of voters in favor of both items. And now law professors are warning that the state could face a constitutional crisis if both measures pass. Well, there's been a lot of articles recently about troubles that the polling industry has faced, so we don't necessarily want to take these poll numbers at face value. Instead, we want to look at poll data in the context of the trend in social mood. Mood has been trending positively over the past few years. We've had new all-time highs in the stock market, and if you look at the Gallup poll on national support for marijuana legalization, there was actually a fall from 58% approval in 2013 to 51% approval in 2014, the biggest decline in support in the history of the data going all the way back to 1969. But as we saw in 2015, support has flown all the way back up to 58%. So what happened? Well, on the shorter term, there was a 16% decline in the Dow Jones Industrial Average, a benchmark stock index in the U.S., from mid-May to late August of 2015, accompanied by a lot of volatility. We saw a return of fear. The market was still down 13% from its May high in late September. And guess when the marijuana polling was done? Well, it was done just after this decline and benefited from this swing in social mood. If they conduct those polls 6 or 8 months earlier, they may not have got the same results. And the Dow has bounced higher since then in the U.S., but as of now, it's still below the May all-time high, so it remains to be seen if that shift in mood will be enough to tilt the scales in favor of legalization in Ohio. We'll tune in and find out. And by the way, that's the same negative social mood trend in which the Liberal Party swept into power in Canada, whose leader, Justin Trudeau, has vowed to legalize pot. But the broader strategic message is to know when the wind is at your back and calibrate your strategy accordingly. It might be easy to get enamored with the latest poll data, and it is true that public opinion is swayed more in favor of pot legalization, but it is also true that on the ground in the U.S., the wind is not exactly fully at the backs of the marijuana advocates and entrepreneurs in 2015. It's not always easy sledding. So in Ohio, to go for a pot monopoly, that's a pretty big reach. The social environment may not be conducive to that. Mood is still fairly elevated, and we're seeing some pushback. In Ohio, not only is there a competing item on the ballot, but advocates behind the pot legalization amendment had to go to the Ohio Supreme Court to get the ballot language changed. They felt the wording was biased against legalization, and the Supreme Court agreed and ordered new language to be drafted. More generally, there's pushback nationwide due to tension between state laws that have legalized pot and pot's federal classification as a Schedule I drug. As a Schedule I drug, its federal classification indicates that it has no known medical uses. Yet 23 states and Washington, D.C. allow some form of legal medical marijuana. An additional 15 states allow some form of legal cannabis oil treatment, and in fact Delaware has both a cannabis oil treatment and legal medical pot. So in total, 38 states plus D.C., the majority of the U.S., have legal medical pot or cannabis in some shape or form. And we think that in the next major negative social mood trend, marijuana will have its greatest chance yet to lose its Schedule I status, and a lot of the other barriers to broader legalization will dissipate. Now, when we talk about medical marijuana, we often think of it as something new, something that perhaps started with California in 1996, but its history of use in the U.S. goes back much farther. In fact, the Marijuana Tax Act, which was passed in 1937, a long time ago, right at a major top of a big bull market, specifically allowed marijuana to continue to be used in the U.S. for medical purposes so long as it was taxed. The tax was opposed by the American Medical Association, not because they objected to medical marijuana, but because the tax was levied on physicians, pharmacists, and cultivators, and they wanted to be able to continue to prescribe cannabis tax-free. Decades later, the act was ruled unconstitutional, but the bigger point is that knowledge of the medical benefits of cannabis extend back a long time, and actually marijuana's medical use was once permitted federally and even taxed at the federal level. Now it's simply a case of everything that was old feels new again as the waves of social psychology cycle through. And how is the marijuana industry doing these days? What are the opportunities? Hey, we'll talk about it. The money side of marijuana coming up. But first, a word from Pop Trends Price Culture. We'll see you after the break.
I'm Robert Folsom, host of the podcast Pop Trends Price Culture. Each week we present real people and real stories as they meet in the crossroads of mood and markets. The range of topics we cover is as broad as the influence of social mood itself, from Lenny Bruce to Orson Welles to vigilante heroes, from world wars to the counterculture of the 1960s, to whether the Fed really does have superpowers. We go there. So please consider this my personal invitation to you to listen for yourself. It's completely free. Our podcast archive now includes more than 60 episodes. The episode show notes often include relevant charts and other visuals, and I don't hold back. A lot of episodes include strong opinions and strong language. You can subscribe to Pop Trends Price Culture on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Or you can go to elliottwave.com/podcast, where you'll find the complete archive. But whether you download it or subscribe or listen online, it's all free. So please do your ears a favor and check out Pop Trends Price Culture. Thanks for your time.
Welcome back to Blazing Green, the socionomics of the next wave of pot legalization, a production of the Socionomics Institute. All right, let's talk turkey, the business of bud. And look, I'm not here as an advocate of legal pot. I'm not here as an opponent. I'm here as an analyst, as a social scientist who's interested in cultural trends. It's all about the information. So, how is the U.S. marijuana industry doing? Well, pretty good. It grew by 74% in 2014, making it one of the fastest growing industries in America. Its size last year was estimated at $2.7 billion, that from researchers at the ArcView Group. And who has benefited? Well, in the medical pot states, you've got the patients, the firms in the industry, but in the legal recreational pot states, the stakeholder who has benefited the most by a mile is the state. So let's talk tax revenue. In Washington, the first year that pot was legal, the state racked up about $70 million in tax revenue. They thought they would just get $36 million, so they did way better than they expected. In Colorado, in the fiscal year that just ended in June, the state brought in more tax revenue from the sale of marijuana than it did from the sale of alcohol. So that gives you a sense of the size of the industry just in that state. So the state governments have been doing very well. But for business owners and operators in the marijuana space in those states, it's been a bit of a different story. There's no problem on the revenue side. In the first week of legal pot sales in Oregon in October, retailers did $11 million in business. In Washington, retailers are on track to do $1.4 million a day in pot sales, so we're talking about $500 million over the course of the year. And sales this year could top $1 billion in Colorado, according to a projection from the National Cannabis Industry Association. But talk to the business owners and they'll tell you that yes, there's a ton of revenue coming in, but the tax burden is so onerous that once you cover your operating costs and pay taxes, there's not a lot left over at the end of the day for the business. So the conversation that's going on is about what tax structure can be put in place so that it makes sense for the state, but also allows for a viable long-term industry to operate. And they're having those conversations in Washington, Colorado, and Oregon today. In the state of Washington, when the sale of legal recreational pot was rolled out, there was a 25% tax at each step as marijuana moved from the grower to the processor and then from the processor to the retailer, and the retailers had to pay federal income taxes on the money that they handed over to the state. Well, that state marijuana tax structure has been replaced with a single 37% tax at the point of retail sale, and the tax is the responsibility of the customer, so the retailer does not have to pay federal taxes on it. But there's still federal taxes on what's left over, and then additional local marijuana taxes and local and state sales taxes as well. In Colorado, the narrative is that the state is making so much money from pot it doesn't know what to do with it. The state plans to cut its marijuana excise tax from 15% to as low as 8% in 2017. And in Oregon, the state has launched legal sales of recreational marijuana tax-free until the end of the year. And as more states come on board, these discussions on tax structures will continue. Ultimately, the legal pot states do want to have an industry that can survive. In addition to the tax burden, another challenge to the survival of the pot industry is access to banking. In fact, there's actually a parallel here to the legalization of an industry in another state decades ago. Casino gaming was legalized in Nevada in 1931, and as the Las Vegas Strip came of age in the 1940s and 50s, operators had a hard time finding banks that would accept their business. After all, Nevada was the only place you could gamble legally. The solution? The operators banded together and created their own bank. Now, there was a huge risk involved. They put all their eggs in one basket. If the bank went under, so would the industry. But on the plus side, the bank aligned the interests of the state with the interests of the industry. The state wanted the industry to survive, so it was incentivized to protect the bank and allow it to operate. It also gave the state added incentive to step in and get in the way when the federal government cracked down on casino gaming in Nevada, as it did numerous times in the early decades of the Strip. Now, ultimately, the ownership structures of the casino resorts changed. Fortune 500 companies came in and acquired them, and there was no longer a need for a single bank to service the industry. But it worked as a short-term solution as the Strip came of age. Well, something similar was tried in Colorado. A proposal was crafted with the help of state regulators and business operators to create a credit union to cater to the legal pot industry. But remember how we talked about how we're seeing pushback and how things on the ground aren't always so easy these days for legal pot advocates and operators? Well, the Federal Reserve has refused to do business with the credit union and won't allow it to operate. It says because marijuana is illegal at the federal level. And the credit union needs the Fed's blessing in order to access the U.S. banking system and conduct electronic transactions. So in the meantime, the pot industry operates largely on a cash basis. In fact, one business opportunity is actually in the security business, transporting all of that cash and keeping it safe. Another Las Vegas parallel is the potential for tourism. In Nevada, casino gaming was the legal activity that made the state unique, but what really allowed the Strip to flourish was the gaming tourism industry. Well, there is a nascent pot tourism industry in Colorado, Washington, and Oregon, but public consumption laws have made that a tougher road to go down at the moment. But the nation's first marijuana resort is set to open later this year. But it's not in Colorado, it's not in Washington, not in Oregon, it's not even in Alaska or Washington, D.C. It's in South Dakota, a state that hasn't even legalized recreational pot. So how are they going to open a resort there? Well, it's going to be on land owned by the Santee Sioux tribe. The federal government cleared the way earlier this year for tribes to legalize marijuana under similar conditions to states. So the tribe voted to do so, and they see it as a potential money-making model that might be attractive to tribes around the country who are looking for economic opportunities. So now let's talk about some other opportunities. One area that's open is branding. Think about any major industry. If I say fast food, for example, some big brands probably come to mind. If I say automobiles, cars, well, there are probably some key brands that you think of. Heck, even if I say something as mundane as tissues, you might be able to think of a brand or two. In fact, one brand has been so successful in the tissue industry that its name is synonymous with the product, Kleenex. So now think of marijuana. Can you name one brand in the marijuana industry, a single firm? Well, we typically don't think of pot as a branded good, and for good reason. Historically, it hasn't been, and even in the legal marijuana states, restrictions on advertising make branding a less viable path at the moment. But as more states come on board, it wouldn't be surprising if some of those promotional restrictions got relaxed, and when that happens, the field will be wide open to become the McDonald's of marijuana, the KFC of Kush, the Burger King of Bud. And what about opportunities for investors in pot stocks? Well, it's been a wild ride so far. Alan Brockstein at 420 Investor began keeping an index of publicly traded companies in the cannabis industry in December 2012. From its inception, the index rose 910% into March 2014. Now, most of that rise happened quickly over a 4-month period from December into March, so there was this huge boom in the pot stocks. But from there was an equally dramatic bust. As of the beginning of October, the pot stocks were down more than 95% from the all-time high. And those are just the trends at the industry level. Once you get into individual firms within the industry, the price action has been even more turbulent. You could look at a chart of just one example, Medical Marijuana Incorporated, ticker symbol MJNA, to get a feel for what some of these rides have been like. There's been a lot of money made and a lot of money lost by investors in the marijuana stocks. And a number of these firms are what my colleague Dave Allman describes as over-the-counter, barely pink-listed, highly volatile penny stocks. Can you think of any major industry in America whose key players trade as penny stocks? So if you think marijuana is going to be a long-run, viable major industry in the U.S., the pot stocks might be something to look at. But of course, that long-run viability could be interrupted in the short term through any number of machinations at the state and federal levels. And of course, investing always carries risks, so it's a good idea to sit down with a competent financial professional to talk through your situation to see what opportunities might fit with you and your investing goals. Now, what about the legalization front? What's the next big opportunity there? Well, aside from Ohio, the next chance for pot legalization is 2016. That's when up to 13 states will have legal recreational pot measures on their ballots. We think the trend of the stock market will be a useful guide to anticipate which way those votes will go. And our research indicates that ultimately the next huge wave of pot legalization, including the opportunity for marijuana to lose its Schedule I status, will come in the next big bear market when social mood is once again profoundly negative. And that's when we could see a perfect storm of 3 factors in favor of legalization come together. First is a shift in priorities. Big negative mood trends drive steep declines in the stock market, civil unrest, economic contraction, rises in unemployment, and on and on. Debates over marijuana use will seem trivial by comparison, and there will be an opportunity for pot's moral stigma to dissipate even more than it has now. The second factor in a potential perfect storm is a shift in public opinion in favor of legalization. That shift began during the previous bear market, and we think the tide will turn even more in favor of legalization in the next big negative mood trend, regardless of what public opinion does in the meantime. And finally, the third factor is cash-strapped states looking for revenue opportunities. As we said, negative mood trends bring economic contraction, and that squeezes state budgets. Think back to 2008 and 2009, where there were tons of stories about state budget shortfalls all over the U.S. So in the next big bear market, we could have a situation where moral qualms associated with pot use fade, the public shifts even more in favor of legalization, and revenue-hungry states look for tax dollars wherever they can find them. That's a social environment conducive to some serious headway on legalization. Now, whether or not we get there in time for the 2016 votes remains to be seen. If you want to know where the markets are headed, my colleagues at Elliott Wave International are happy to help you out. If you go over to elliottwave.com, you'll learn how to get their opinion. But as socionomists, we can observe that the next big negative mood trend, whenever it arrives, will be the next big opportunity for legalization. In the meantime, if you're a political advocate of marijuana, it's a great time to build your infrastructure, start planning, and be ready to act when that window of opportunity opens. And hey, if you're wondering whether social mood might be an important factor in understanding changes in public opinion and social actions on a number of topics, you're right. We've talked about pot today, but we could have talked about a host of issues, from fashion to entertainment, trends in peace and war, sports, politics, financial markets, the economy, the list goes on and on. If you'd like to learn more about our analysis of pot and other important cultural trends, head on over to socionomics.net. If you click on Get Free Socionomics Email Updates at the top right of the screen, we'll send you new information and resources each week with our take on history and what's going on in the world today. And if you go to socionomics.net/marijuana, you'll find our research on pot. It's a trend we've got our eye on. We'll continue to cover it in the pages of our monthly magazine, The Socionomist. And if you have any questions or if you want to get in touch, give us some feedback about the show today, you can drop us a line on Twitter at Socionomics. Check us out on Facebook. We're the Socionomics Institute. And you can email us institute@socionomics.net. Thanks so much for hanging out. It's been a ton of fun. I'm Matt Lampert, the director of the Socionomics Institute. We'll catch up with you next time. And until then, as Robert Prechter says, may you always ride the perfect wave.